July 14th, 1943. 1100 hours. A wheat field shimmered under the Sicilian sun near the village of Santo Pietro. 37 prisoners stood in rows, barefoot and shirtless, their uniforms stripped to prevent escape. 35 Italians and 2 Germans, conscripts, mechanics, airfield ground crew, men who had surrendered hours earlier with their hands raised, expecting the protections guaranteed by the Geneva Convention. Sergeant Horace T. West, 33 years old, a cook from Oklahoma serving with a company of the 180th Infantry Regiment, borrowed a Thompson submachine gun from another soldier. He requested an extra magazine, 30 rounds. Then he marched the prisoners behind a small hill out of sight from the advancing American column. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. West positioned the men in a line facing away from him. He raised the Thompson and opened fire, sweeping the weapon across the group. Bodies crumpled into the wheat. Some tried to run. West continued firing. When he walked back to rejoin his unit, 37 men lay dead in that field. Their crime had been wearing the wrong uniform in the wrong place at the wrong time. 400 yards away, at nearly the same moment, Captain John T. Compton was dealing with his own prisoners. 36 Italian soldiers had surrendered during the assault on Biscari airfield. Compton had not slept in 4 days. Sniper fire had killed several of his men that morning, including medics trying to treat the wounded. He assembled a firing squad from his platoon, lined the prisoners against a wall, and gave the order to fire. This was the Biscari massacre. 73 unarmed men executed in 2 separate incidents on the same day by soldiers of the same regiment in the same corner of Sicily. It was the first major American ground combat on European soil. And it was not an aberration. This is the story of what American forces did during World War II that you were never taught in school, the executions that were covered up, the atrocities that were excused, the crimes that were quietly buried under the weight of victory, because history remembers winners, and winners write their own stories. The Biscari killings did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in an atmosphere cultivated by American commanders. Before the Sicily invasion, General George S. Patton reportedly addressed officers of the 45th Infantry Division with words that would later become evidence in court-martial proceedings. Multiple witnesses testified that he told them, in essence, to show no mercy to the enemy. That when enemy soldiers tried to surrender after shooting at American troops, they should be killed rather than taken prisoner. That his men needed the killer instinct. The exact words vary across different accounts, but the message was consistent and unmistakable. Similar exhortations echoed through briefing rooms across the Mediterranean theater: kill or be killed, show no mercy, take no prisoners. When reports of the Biscari massacre reached division headquarters, the Army faced a problem. The men who committed the killings claimed they were following orders they believed came from their commanding general, the same general who would later become a national hero, the same general who would slap 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue and nearly lose his command over it, the same general who would write in his diary after learning of the executions that he hoped we can conceal this. Sergeant West was court-martialed in September 1943. He admitted the killings but pleaded not guilty, arguing he was following orders and suffering from temporary insanity due to combat stress. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. But the sentence was quietly remitted in November 1944. West was restored to active duty, transferred to the 100th Infantry Division, and continued serving until the end of the war. He received an honorable discharge. Captain Compton never faced punishment at all. His court-martial ended in acquittal. The defense successfully argued he was following orders from his commanding general. 4 months later, Compton was killed in action in Italy. His death removed the possibility that the case would ever be revisited. The Army's official position became that these were isolated incidents committed by exhausted men under extreme stress. But the pattern would repeat itself across Europe and the Pacific for the next 2 years, and the men who committed these acts would almost never face consequences. The winter of 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge. On December 17th, Waffen-SS troops under Joachim Peiper executed 84 American prisoners near the town of Malmedy in Belgium. The bodies were found frozen in the snow. Word spread through American lines within hours, and the response was swift. Orders circulated through multiple units. No SS troops or paratroopers will be taken prisoner but will be shot on sight. The 90th Infantry Division began executing Waffen-SS prisoners so systematically that headquarters had to issue express orders to take some alive for intelligence purposes. At least one American unit issued written instructions that prisoners should not be taken under any circumstances. On January 1st, 1945, near the village of Chenogne, soldiers of the 11th Armored Division assembled approximately 80 German prisoners in a snow-covered field. These were not SS troops. They were regular Wehrmacht soldiers from the Führer Escort Brigade and 3rd Panzergrenadier Division, men who had surrendered after the Americans retook the village. Staff Sergeant John W. Faig watched from behind a tank as his fellow soldiers lined the prisoners up in groups of 25 to 30. Machine guns were positioned. Faig later wrote that he knew they were going to shoot them and he hated this business. He hid so he would not be asked to participate. The Germans were machine-gunned in the open field. We were committing the same crimes we were now accusing the Japs and Germans of doing, Faig wrote. General Patton learned of the killings. His diary entry for January 4th, 1945 reads, "The 11th Armored is very green and took unnecessary losses to no effect. There were also some unfortunate incidents in the shooting of prisoners. I hope we can conceal this. General Eisenhower ordered an investigation after the war. The 11th Armored Division reported that records were unavailable due to the unit's rapid disbandment and destruction of documents. No one was ever charged. The incident remained classified for decades. Nuremberg prosecutor Ben Ferencz later observed that American war crimes were rarely investigated with the same vigor applied to enemy actions. The focus remained on prosecuting the defeated. Questions of accountability for the victors were largely set aside. The pattern in Europe was troubling, but in the Pacific, it was systematic. American servicemen in the Pacific often deliberately killed Japanese soldiers who had surrendered. This was not rumor or post-war revisionism. It was documented by American commanders, recorded in unit histories, and admitted by veterans in oral histories decades later. The reasons were complex. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated to fight to the death. They rarely surrendered, and when they did, some used the opportunity for suicidal attacks. American troops learned to distrust any Japanese soldier raising his hands. Intelligence officers complained that combat units were not taking prisoners because they did not want to risk the danger. But racism played an undeniable role. American propaganda portrayed the Japanese as subhuman, as animals, as vermin to be exterminated. Life magazine published photographs of Japanese skulls and body parts collected by American servicemen. The rhetoric from the highest levels of government encouraged viewing the enemy as something less than human. Historian James Weingartner found that the very low number of Japanese in American prisoner of war compounds resulted from two factors: Japanese reluctance to surrender, yes, but also a widespread American conviction that the Japanese were animals or subhuman and unworthy of the normal treatment accorded to prisoners of war. When Japanese soldiers did attempt to surrender, they ran extraordinary risks. An official Office of War Information report stated that fear of being killed after surrendering was one of the main factors which influenced Japanese troops to fight to the death. It may have been more important than fear of disgrace or desire to die for the emperor. Some American commanders explicitly discouraged taking prisoners. Others issued informal instructions that prisoners were too much bother to deal with. When Captain Burden, an Army interrogator at Guadalcanal, noted that prisoners were being shot during transport, the explanation was simple. It was too much bother to take them in. The trophy-taking was even more disturbing. American servicemen collected body parts from Japanese soldiers as souvenirs. Skulls were the most prized items, but teeth, ears, and bones were also taken. The practice became so widespread that it was reported in American newspapers and magazines. Life magazine published a photograph in May 1944 showing a young woman writing a thank you note to her boyfriend for sending her a Japanese skull. The caption described it as a gift. President Franklin Roosevelt was reportedly given a letter opener carved from a Japanese soldier's arm bone by a congressman, though he ordered it returned for proper burial. Marine Corps veteran Eugene Sledge described the practice in his memoir. He watched fellow Marines extract gold teeth from Japanese soldiers, including at least one man who was still alive. The Japanese was wounded severely in the back and could not move his arms. Otherwise, he would have resisted to his last breath. But the Marine wanted those gold-crowned teeth. He put the point of his knife on the base of a tooth and hit the handle with his palm. Because the Japanese was kicking his feet and thrashing about, the knife point glanced off the tooth and sank deeply into the victim's mouth. The Japanese government used photographs of American trophy-taking for propaganda, portraying Americans as barbaric savages. It was effective because the photographs were real. April 29, 1945. The 45th Infantry Division approached Dachau concentration camp. These were the same troops from the same unit that had committed the Biscari massacre 2 years earlier. What they found at Dachau exceeded anything they had imagined. A train of 36 boxcars sat on the tracks outside the camp, filled with the decomposing bodies of prisoners who had been transported from other camps. Inside the wire, thousands of emaciated survivors wandered among stacks of corpses. The crematorium ovens were still warm, the gas chamber still functional. Lieutenant William Walsh described expecting the camp to resemble an American prisoner of war facility. He was not prepared for what he saw. When the Americans encountered SS guards, something broke. Soldiers began executing them on the spot. In the coal yard, approximately 16 SS men were lined against a wall and machine-gunned. Another 17 were killed in Tower B. More were killed throughout the day by soldiers and liberated prisoners alike. Some accounts claim the death toll reached into the hundreds. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who commanded the troops that entered the camp, later stated that the actual number was probably 30 to 50. He said he personally intervened to stop the killings, firing his pistol into the air and ordering his men to stand down. General Patton, recently appointed military governor of Bavaria, chose to dismiss the charges. The witnesses were never cross-examined. The report remained classified until 1991. A deputy judge advocate concluded that while the killings were technically a violation of international law, extenuating circumstances warranted dropping the case. In light of the conditions which greeted the eyes of the first combat troops to reach Dachau, it is not believed that justice or equity demand that the difficult and perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility now be undertaken. The men who liberated Dachau had witnessed horrors that defied comprehension. Many historians argue that their actions, while illegal, were understandable, perhaps even justified. But the same argument was never extended to enemy soldiers who committed similar acts under extreme circumstances. The law of war does not permit exceptions for emotional distress. It does not allow reprisals against prisoners, regardless of what their comrades may have done. The men at Dachau committed war crimes, and America chose not to prosecute them. The firebombing campaign against Japan raised different questions. These were not spontaneous acts of violence by individual soldiers. They were calculated military operations approved at the highest levels of command. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers approached Tokyo at low altitude. They carried 1,565 tons of incendiary bombs, including napalm and white phosphorus. Their target was a residential district called Shitamachi, home to 750,000 people living in wooden buildings packed so closely together that fire could spread from house to house in seconds. The attack was deliberately designed to cause mass civilian casualties. The orders issued to bomber crews stated that the purpose was to destroy small factories in the target area, but also noted that it was intended to cause civilian casualties as a means of disrupting production at major industrial facilities. General Curtis LeMay later admitted, "Killing Japanese did not bother me very much at that time. It was getting the war over that bothered me. That single night killed more people than any other air raid in history. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 80,000. Japanese authorities counted over 97,000. Some historians believe the true number exceeded 100,000. More people died in those few hours than in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. 16 square miles of the city burned. 1 million people were left homeless. The fires were so intense that the updrafts pulled people off their feet and into the flames. The Sumida River boiled with the bodies of those who had tried to escape into the water. The raids continued throughout the spring and summer. 60 major Japanese cities were firebombed. The total civilian death toll exceeded 300,000. 8 million people lost their homes. 40% of Japan's urban areas were destroyed. Robert McNamara, who worked as a statistical analyst for LeMay's command and later became Secretary of Defense, reflected on the campaign decades later. LeMay said if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. The distinction between military necessity and mass murder became difficult to identify. The stated goal was to destroy Japanese war production, but the primary effect was the killing of civilians. The campaign was designed to terrorize the Japanese population into demanding surrender. It failed. The Japanese government did not surrender until after the atomic bombs were dropped. The firebombing killed hundreds of thousands without achieving its strategic objective. Throughout the war, American military justice operated on two tracks, one for white soldiers, one for everyone else. In France, 139 of the 152 troops charged with rape were African American. Of the 29 soldiers executed for rape, 25 were African American. This racial disparity was not explained by the demographics of the Army, which was approximately 10% black. Some convictions were based on circumstantial evidence that would never have held up against white defendants. In one case, a black soldier was identified as the perpetrator solely because he was much larger than other soldiers. In another, 3 black soldiers were convicted of gang rape based on a white streak of paint found on one man's shirt that matched a wall in the victim's room. White soldiers accused of similar crimes faced different outcomes. Those in mobile units were harder to track down. Those who were caught received lighter sentences. Those who were convicted were often released early or had their sentences quietly remitted. The disparity extended beyond sexual assault. Courts-martial for murder, assault, and other crimes showed similar patterns. Black soldiers were more likely to be charged, more likely to be convicted, and more likely to receive severe punishments. The military justice system reflected the racism of American society, and the victims of that racism had no recourse. The question of American war crimes raises uncomfortable truths about the nature of war itself. The men who committed these acts were not fundamentally different from other soldiers. They were ordinary Americans, drafted from farms and factories and offices across the country. They were trained to kill. They were placed in situations of extreme stress. And some of them did terrible things. The difference between American atrocities and German or Japanese atrocities was not the nature of the acts themselves. It was the context, the scale, and the consequences. American war crimes were generally committed by individuals or small units acting without explicit authorization. German and Japanese war crimes were frequently systematic, ordered from above, and executed as policy. American soldiers who committed atrocities sometimes faced court-martial, even if the outcomes were inconsistent. German and Japanese soldiers who committed atrocities were often following orders from their governments. But the distinction is not as clean as it appears. Patton's speech before Sicily was heard by thousands. The "take no prisoners" orders, after Malmedy circulated through multiple divisions, the firebombing campaign was approved at the highest levels of command. These were not isolated incidents committed by rogue soldiers. They were patterns of behavior encouraged or tolerated by American leadership. American war crimes went largely unprosecuted for multiple reasons. Destroyed records and rapid unit disbandments made investigations difficult. The emerging Cold War created pressure to move forward rather than examine the past. Prosecuting American soldiers would have complicated the narrative of the Good War and undermined the moral authority needed to prosecute German and Japanese war criminals. It would have forced America to confront the uncomfortable reality that its own soldiers were capable of the same acts it condemned in its enemies, and so the stories were buried, the records were classified, the witnesses were discouraged from speaking, the history books were written to emphasize American heroism and downplay American sins. Sergeant Horace West received an honorable discharge and lived quietly in Oklahoma until his death in 1974. The soldiers who executed prisoners at Chinon returned home to farms and families and never spoke of what they had done. The men who machine-gunned SS guards at Dachau became ordinary citizens who attended church and raised children and told stories about liberating concentration camps without mentioning the parts that came after. The war produced the greatest generation. It also produced men who committed mass murder. Often they were the same men. That is not an indictment of American soldiers. It is an acknowledgment of what war does to human beings. It transforms ordinary people into killers. It creates situations where the rules that govern civilized behavior cease to apply. It forces men to make decisions in seconds that will haunt them for decades. The uncomfortable truth is that American soldiers were not morally superior to their enemies. They were better supplied, better equipped, and on the winning side of history. They fought for a cause that was, on balance, more just than the cause of their opponents. But they were still human, and humans in war do terrible things. The story of American war crimes is not a story of villains. It is a story of what happens when ordinary people are placed in extraordinary circumstances, when the training that teaches them to kill overcomes the conscience that tells them to stop, when the hatred cultivated by propaganda overwhelms the humanity that connects us all. The men who committed these acts went home and became fathers and grandfathers. They built houses and businesses and communities. They told their children about the war, but not all of it. not the parts that kept them awake at night, not the faces of the men they killed after they had surrendered. Some of them never escaped what they had done. They carried it with them until they died. Others managed to compartmentalize, to lock those memories away in places they never visited. A few convinced themselves that what they did was justified, that the enemy deserved it, that war is hell, and hell has no rules. The official histories remember the liberation of Dachau, not the executions that followed. They remember the victory at Sicily, not the bodies in the wheat field. They remember the surrender of Japan, not the 100,000 civilians who burned to death in Tokyo. But history has two sides, and the full story includes both. Not because American soldiers were uniquely evil, they were not. Not because the Allied cause was unjust. It was not, but because the truth matters, because the victims of these crimes deserve to be remembered, because understanding what happened is the only way to prevent it from happening again. The men who died in that field near Santo Pietro were not combatants. They were prisoners who had surrendered under the protection of international law. The women and children who burned in Tokyo were not military targets. They were civilians whose only crime was living in a city made of wood. The SS guards at Dachau were monsters who had participated in genocide, but executing them without trial was still murder. War crimes are not defined by who commits them. They are defined by what is done. And what American forces did, in some cases, met that definition. This is not the story you learned in school. It is not the story told in movies or memorials or veterans' parades, but it is part of the story. And pretending it did not happen does not make it go away. The greatest generation was not perfect. No generation is. They fought a terrible war against terrible enemies, and most of them did so with honor, but some of them did not. And those stories deserve to be told, not to diminish their service, not to equate American soldiers with the enemies they fought, but to remember that war is not a story of good against evil. It is a story of human beings doing what human beings do when the constraints of civilization are removed. The lesson is not that America was no better than its enemies. The lesson is that war makes monsters of us all, and the only way to honor those who served is to tell the whole truth about what they experienced, what they witnessed, and what some of them did. Because history written by the winners is not history, it is propaganda. And the truth, however, uncomfortable, is what we owe to everyone who lived through that war. The soldiers who fought with honor, the prisoners who died without justice, and the generations that came after, who deserve to understand what really happened when the world went to war. If you found this exploration of the past valuable, please like and subscribe to help us keep telling these difficult stories. History matters, and so does the truth. Until next time.